Hi everyone, welcome to the Weekend and History on Trial. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy. We are going to be talking about the Black Irish and the history of that group in the Americas. We're going to be delving into the psychology of identity with respect to this group, and also a word of caution regarding these terms black and white. These terms have been misused over time. These are adjectives, and often they are used as nouns to identify people versus simply descriptors of people. And so that is something to think about going forward in the future and as you are filling out those census forms also. And so we're going to be talking about the brown Irish who were removed from Ireland and banished to the Americas. We're going to quickly talk about how that happened and why that happened. And we're going to look at some phenotype dynamics related to that particular group and also some of the surnames that some of you may share with this particular group of people. We are going to start our discussion from Whence the Black Irish of Jamaica by Dr. Joseph Williams. We are going to focus on this one source, and the reason for focusing on one source is it helps to keep people very narrowly focused in terms of the discussion, and you don't have to string a number of theories and constructs together when we are focusing on one source. And there is enough meat in this one source to delve into to address what we need to address related to how the Black Irish ended up in the Americas in the first place. The author summarizes this work by indicating that the Irish made their way to Jamaica from Ireland through Barbados to Jamaica. And you can see in history that Barbados serves as a central point for a number of dynamics that were going on in terms of indentured servitude, in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, and also in terms of quote unquote punishing Indians on the mainland and in the islands by sending them there as a sort of penal colony. We're going to start our discussion by looking at some old pictures of some small children in Jamaica, and these are the Black Irish of Jamaica. And you can see the surnames Collins, O'Hare, McCormick, and Kennedy. And you can also note that these young children also have that prominent brow ridge that was discussed in a previous discussion. And here we have some additional little ones. We have Mr. Collins, and we have Walsh, we have a McDermott, we have a Burke. And so we have a variety of Irish surnames among the children in Ireland. And here we have a young man identified as someone who is typical of the Black Irish in Jamaica. Now, there are a number of ancient sources that talk about the phenotypes of the individuals in the Isles, and we've discussed some of those before. And so this is a more recent discussion, and this looks very plainly at the people in Jamaica. And also this would include people mainland America, and of course Barbados also, because you can imagine some never left Barbados. And so one of the things that happens when there is a discussion about surnames for people who are brown in the Americas, there is always the assumption that these surnames came from enslavement. And one of the things pointed out in this book is that you have these Irish surnames, and they are clustered in Jamaica. You have these Irish surnames, and the explanation is always that there was a slave master again. But what they found is that in some cases you can't find the name of a slave master or a planter, a plantation owner, with the surname of the individual. And this is the case with the surname Burke. So with the little boy whose surname is Burke, there is no slavery narrative in Jamaica that goes along with this surname. So it brings into question how this child came upon this particular surname if this was all about slavery And it was all about this surname being passed on by some slave owner. And so you will see, as in mainland America, that often Jamaicans cannot trace their history, their individual lineage, back to a person who was enslaved. But what they can readily do is trace back to a point where they find an ancestor with one of these Scottish or Irish surnames that may have been indentured, may have come on a convict ship, and may have been banished from Ireland. Now, this is really important because you have a number of Jamaican individuals who travel to the UK, they travel to Ireland, they travel to Scotland as outsiders, when in fact they were removed from their land. That land belonged to their ancestors, and they are going as if they are visitors, begging for something, begging for a sense of belonging, begging for a visa to be there, begging to stay there, and then being deported out again, just like their ancestors were. So let's get to some of the specifics about how did the Irish get to Jamaica in the first place. Some of you may recall some of our earlier discussions related to how people were deceived into slavery. And if you remember, the term was blackbirding. And so we're going to look at how blackbirding actually worked in this dynamic of removing people from Ireland and then getting them into the Americas. And here you can see through blackbirding that English slave traders, these human traffickers, they shipped in the course of 4 years, they shipped over 6,400 Irish men, women, boys, and maidens. And this was in 1655. And the way they did this was they would delude the poor people, giving them these false pretenses, that blackbirding dynamic. So they would trick them into going to certain places and then force them onto ships. And then they would take them from those ships into the Americas. And what this entailed often was you'd have a mother who would be taken away from her husband and her children, a father who would be taken away from his wife and children. They were stealing children. You might remember from some of our earlier discussions about them stealing children from the UK and then putting them on ships and shipping them to America. And so the children would have no recourse. They would be shipped over. And oftentimes those children, as you can imagine, not recognizing that they even had any rights, those children might be more readily enslaved versus simply indentured. And some people might wonder, how did the individuals end up in Jamaica versus going somewhere else? And this has come up in a number of readings related to Scotland and Ireland, is this dynamic whereby certain people were determined to be better suited for places such as Jamaica and Barbados based upon the hot weather. And there was a belief that certain other individuals could not survive in that particular climate. And it had a lot to do with phenotype, skin color. The researcher does note that there were 3 social classes of individuals in Jamaica, and those 3 social classes included masters, servants, and enslaved individuals. They also clarify in many writings that you have a difference between indentured labor or bonds person bonding out and an individual who is enslaved for life. However, when a person is exiled and deported against their will, any period of time that they are not there voluntarily, that constitutes enslavement. You can call it all sorts of other fancy names. However, it is enslavement. It is against their will. And classifying it as enslavement for a number of years does not change the fact that it is human trafficking and it is enslavement. One of of the things noted is that there was a focus on kidnapping the girls and children in Ireland. And not only were they taking girls, in particular, children, they were also taking children who were identified as being of gentle birth. And gentle birth is another way of saying children of nobility. And so these would be considered higher socioeconomic status little girls that were being taken by these man catchers, as the author refers to them. And there's an indication that this did not slow down until the slave catchers, these human traffickers, actually started stealing some of the children and daughters of the English themselves. So not just the Irish, but also starting to steal the English children. Now, if you remember, there was slavery that was going on with the Barbary Coast slave trade dynamic, and also going around those isles and enslaving people at the same time the transatlantic slave trade was going on. So you have a lot of weird dynamics going on where they were moving people around and confusing people in terms of their ultimate identities as they moved them around. The UK was very fond of using this dynamic of punishing rebels by giving them choices between being convicted of high treason and being executed, or being deported, transported out, banished, removed, in a way very similar to what happened to those identified as American Indian. So there were removal acts and removal actions going on in both Ireland and Scotland. And so those individuals who refused to remove voluntarily, they could be captured and then sent away. And here you can see a discussion related to what would happen when individuals were convicted of treason and then sent to the Americas or to some other place beyond the seas. And so there were a number of places that people were going to during this time period, quote unquote, beyond the seas. And this would be part of their banishment. And because this was an ethnic cleansing process, this was not just simply about being a rebel. This was an ethnic cleansing process. And Scottish and Irish and English historians know this. And so you had this banishment process, and there was also a punishment if anyone returned from the Americas into Ireland without permission, without a license from the Great Seal of England. And those individuals who did that, they would suffer the pains of death as felons by virtue of the act from Parliament. If you've been tracing your ancestry, you probably have already uncovered some of these Black Irish ancestors. We're going to go over some of the names of some of the Irish, not all of them, because of course there are so many names. But you might do some research on your surname and you might uncover that your surname has Irish roots. And you might also notice that if you had an Irish ancestor or a Scottish ancestor, that there was often an intermarrying going on with individuals who were identified as American Indian. Let's review some of these Irish surnames. You might recognize some of them, and maybe one might even be your surname. So we have Agnew and Ahern, Armstrong, Ash, Baldwin, Banks, Bannon, Barberry, Barrington, Berry, Bohannon, as in Hamilton Bohannon, Boyce, Boyle, Burke, Bradley, and Brady. You might also notice with Irish surnames, there's often an O in front of the name. And so you might have a Brian or an O'Brien. You also have here Brennan, Bryan, O'Brien, again, Coffey, Callahan, Cahill, Carey, Carnahan, Clancy, Casey, Colley, Commons, Coakley, and Connolly. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. It's just a sample of some names to kind of get you started in terms of your thinking. And we also have some additional names: Cunningham, Curry, Darby, Dodd, Gilmore, Glenn, Henry, Higgins, Howard, Hughes, Hopkins, Holland, McNeil, Mansfield, McKenna. Remember, whenever you see that MC or MAC, you are treading into the Scotland, Ireland surname waters. You also have Neville and Reed, and these are just some examples. One thing that you might want to make note of is off to the right-hand side there, you see two of the little children, Burke and Mackey. And you also see two adults. Now, these adults, interestingly, are Choctaw on the left-hand side, and then Tasmanian on the right-hand side. And you'll notice that the phenotypes of these individuals look similar to the phenotypes of the children who are identified as the Black Irish. You will also notice that prominent brow ridge. As we wrap this up, we have discussed how the Irish ended up in Jamaica and other parts of the Americas. And you've also seen the dynamics of deception and how the ideas of slavery and indentured servitude might get very confused in these dynamics. And you've also seen how these phenotypes of the Black Irish are similar to individuals who have been identified as American Indian and also Tasmanian. This might also give you some food for thought related to the idea of race as it is discussed in America and the Americas. One of the things that happened again is that you had individuals being separated, families being separated based upon skin color. And so those who were considered darker would be sent to one place, and those who were considered lighter would be sent to another place. And there were privileges attached to lighter skin. And so you might see families doing this process of lightening the line and then identifying completely as quote unquote white. But they might mention that they come from Black Irish ancestors. And what you'll often hear with that is that these Black Irish ancestors were called the Black Irish because they had black hair. And so some of that is a form of ancestral denial and self-hatred. So one of the things that people might want to start thinking about again is thinking differently about people when they see people with the same or similar last name, starting to think about those people as perhaps distant cousins. Because if you really start tracing these ancestral lines, you will find that there is a common ancestor that goes along with these surnames. If you have any other ideas or thoughts or reflections or analyses, you can put them in the comment section and start a discussion. This is dedicated to Hamilton Bohannon. Rest in peace.